We have practiced cross-hatching, hatching, stippling, scumbling with pen and ink and various other art mediums. Now I want us to actually try and blend with our pen and ink, which is much more difficult. To begin with, you can see how many different pens I actually tested out and how well they mark. I didn't want a pen that the ink came out too fast because then it was going to be harder to control. But I tested it out and just got comfortable with the material. And then the next step is to actually start your value scale. I began my value scale on the darkest side where the shadows are going to go. And the reason for that was I could kind of get comfortable with the pen and my mark making techniques without worrying how light I needed to shade, because your shadows should be your darkest areas anyway. And so for a value scale, it's the change between light and dark. So on one end of the value scale, you're going to have the highlights, the lighter areas. The midtones will go in the middle, which is like your gray areas, and then the shadows are going to be your darkest areas. Don't start by coloring really dark. You can always go back and darken it later. But what I found is holding the pen a little bit further back from the tip and then kind of using almost like the side of my pen rather than coloring directly on the very end of the ballpoint pen tended to work better for me. I could control it a little bit better. It's not going to be perfect. Part of this project and today's practice is just choosing not to get frustrated and instead trying to work with the material itself. And you have to learn how to control the material. Don't let it control you. Just because you might struggle in the beginning doesn't mean that you won't find what works best for you and your mark making techniques. So I just am very lightly laying my pen on the paper. I'm not even applying pressure to the paper. I'm just letting my pen rest on the paper, and I'm just kind of very carefully going back and forth. I sometimes change my directions to try and blend out the pen making marks, and then I go ahead and I'm like, well, I'm just going to try and see how light I can get with it, just so I can begin my actual value scale process where it changes from light to dark. So I start in the beginning, and there's some areas I need to blend out. And anytime you're blending an area out, you need to kind of use broader strokes rather than like really small, circular, tight mark making techniques, because broader strokes are going to help to blend it out. So color in different directions and over a larger area when you're doing your lighter areas, because that will help to kind of keep it light. I think something else that's really important for me to note is that I'm not actually pressing down on the paper even in the shadowed areas. I'm only creating very light layers, and the more I layer a light amount of pressure, the darker it gradually gets, which helps to keep it more blended out. So don't press down in your dark areas. Just go over and over and over, and it will gradually build up to a darker value. For this next value scale, I want you to actually come up with your own mark making technique. It could be the letter of your name. I'm going to choose to do a star. You could do a heart. I don't want you to copy mine and do a star as well. But basically, you're just going to find a mark, and you're going to repeat it over and over again to fill up the value scale. And wherever your shadows are, you're going to layer it more so that it becomes darker. And then your gray areas, you're just going to kind of keep it spaced apart or not layer it as much. And then in your light areas, you're going to space out your marks even more. But for this original mark making technique, I want you to actually come up with a single mark and not just like scribble all over the whole thing. So like I said, I'm just using a star, and I kind of go halfway through my value scale, and I did this with my first value scale too, and then I jump over to the highlights to make sure that I don't get too dark over the entire value scale. So I'm starting kind of like a nice even layer of stars, and then I'm going to gradually start to darken my midtones, because my highlights, I don't think I can get much lighter with that now that I've already put the pen down, because pen is pretty permanent. But now I'm going to gradually darken my midtones, and that's a pretty good like shade for my midtones. And now I just need to get really dark with my shadows. So I'm going to layer much more with the pens with the stars and just kind of overlap the stars much more. And I'm not actually pressing down. I'm just putting more stars on top of one another to create my darker area. So you're going to have to create an original mark and try and sneak it into your pen and ink drawing for this Kill the Pen project. So my next thing I'm going to work on is my sphere. And you can see the top left-hand corner is where the light source is coming from. And if the light source is coming from the left-hand corner, then the shadow is going to be cast on the bottom right-hand corner, just like our example down below. So I kind of labeled the different areas. Oh, I realized you can't see every single one of my labels, but that's okay. The highlights are your light areas. The cast shadow is what is on the actual like table or surface that the ball is sitting on. The midtones are the gray areas in the sphere where it goes from highlight to shadow. Those midtones lie in between. And then there's a really little reflected light. It almost creates like a white outline around the bottom of the ball, and that is right above the cast shadow. So I kind of, again, begin with my darker areas. I don't press down really hard to begin with, but I just am trying to get comfortable with the pen. I find that every time I put pen to paper, it's almost like a little bit nerve-wracking. So I'm just trying to get comfortable with the material by starting in a darker area because I can always go back and darken it later. Then once I get comfortable with it, I'm going to go ahead and move on to my midtones just so I can kind of block them in and make sure that I start really light so that I can make sure I don't get too dark. Most of my pen and ink drawings end up darker than any reference photo I end up going from. So if you end up getting a little bit too dark with your midtones, just go back and darken your shadows even more so that you still have that gradient where it goes from light gradually to dark. That is the main thing with creating a dimensional drawing. You want to blend your shadows, not necessarily by like rubbing your finger over it, but you want it to gradually go from highlight to midtone to shadow, not an abrupt change. So I'm also doing something called directional shading, and that's where I turn my paper to really get that like rounded direction that the sphere is actually shaped in. So even though I'm shading kind of in linear motion as it appears on my demo, I'm turning my paper so that it kind of follows the curve of the sphere, and that's called directional shading. That's going to make your drawing look much more realistic. So it's really important you try and do that. And I'm trying to fill in that kind of strange gap area right there. It's important also to every now and then just like clean off your pen, because the ink kind of gunks up at the end and then can leave like a really dark mark in a random light area that you don't want to happen. So clean it off every now and then, either on the side of your paper or a tissue. And then once you've kind of blocked in your midtones and made sure that you've left your highlight white, you can go in and you can layer back over your shadow so that it becomes darker and darker. Again, I'm not pressing down really hard with my shadow. I'm just layering back over it, and I'm constantly turning my paper to try and make sure that I follow the shape of the sphere, which is a rounded shape. I also need to remember to do my core shadow, and so I will put that in here in just a minute. I also want to note that the blended technique with the pen and ink is not necessarily actually like blending it with your finger or blending it with a blending stump. Instead, it's just trying to create really light pressure with your pen so that it appears blended. It's not actually going to be something that you blend out with your finger. It's just appearing blended. So that, like I said, is a much more difficult technique than we've practiced in the past. So if you struggle with it today, don't feel defeated, because it is challenging for me as well. And I ended up almost having more of like a cross-hatching technique because I could not get a perfectly blended pen and ink technique, and that's okay too.